Hey everyone, welcome to J-Face Games. Today we are talking about our RPG system that we're trying to build. And currently I'm in the works of trying to build an encounter, which was requested by some of the audience because it was going to be helpful to get feedback and to get an idea of what's going on. And while I was starting to design that, I realized that one of the biggest challenges was understanding movement and distances in the game. It's when you're designing all of your powers, you have to understand what you're dealing with, right? When you're designing all those interactions, you got to know what's happening. And the only way you can know what's happening is if you know how you're going to be measuring things in the game. So, in essence, there's three ways of kind of doing movement in my brain, at least, for encounters. Three different types of sort of encounters in general, or combat systems, would be you got a grid-based system, which I'm kind of over grid-based systems at this point in time. I'm currently in a 4th edition D&D game on Fantasy Grounds, which is it's awesome. We're having a good time, but things slow down when all of a sudden you're having to count out spaces, right? You get that sort of it breaks you out of the illusion because all of a sudden you're counting and doing math on the spaces, and it just doesn't feel as like exciting, I think. So that's one, grid-based. The other end of the spectrum is theater of the mind, where you're just using sort of terminology like nearby or adjacent or those kind of things. And that's a good way of doing it too, but I like tactics. And sometimes when you're doing all that theater of the mind stuff and it's all sort of just in the DM's head, giving you an idea of where you are, sometimes you lose out on those tactics a little bit. You can be very creative, but you lose out on some of the actual like grittiness of tactics. And in the middle is the idea of zones. And I think that some games that did that really well is Fantasy Grounds does zones well. I think the Cypher system does it. I don't remember. But not Fantasy Grounds, I meant to say Fate. Fate does zones really well. And it's the idea that you just sort of take a location and you split it up into different sort of areas, right? And you're saying you're in this warehouse, and the warehouse has 3 zones. It's got the entry sort of way, it's got the main sort of room, and it's got a balcony on top, right? And those are different zones. And zones can interact with each other, but your movement is going from one zone to another, but maybe you can shoot from one zone to the other, etc., right? And so I like the idea of zones, and that's what we're going to do today. So I'm using Publisher here to kind of denote zones because I can move these objects around, okay? So bear with me here, but the idea is that each one of these little boxes here could be just like an index card. So this could be index card and poker chips that represent sort of like your encounter, because I like that. I think that it's nice to be able to just do something quick and easy. You could be more, you could use big models or etc., but I'm just thinking in terms of what would be super simple. Let's just do index cards and sort of tokens, right? These represent the 4 sort of like nomenclature terms for where you are in relation to other creatures. You could be engaged with them, nearby, a short distance, or a long distance. So let's start with this top index card. We have the red, which will be the enemy, and you have the green, which is our hero. And they are both in this zone. Let's just say this is like, this is a tavern, right? So this is the sitting area, the dining hall of the tavern. If they're both in this blue square or on top of this index card, they are nearby each other, okay? They're considered nearby. So whatever sort of actions can be done when you're nearby someone, you could be attacking them with a sword, you could be shooting them with a crossbow, you could be doing all kinds of stuff, casting spells, etc. But if one of them touches the other one or overlaps or whatever you want to do, now they're engaged. Engaged should represent that sort of action where I think 4th edition or 5th edition, once you're next to another person's square, in 5th edition for instance, now you have to be wary of how you move, because now when you move, they might get attack of opportunity. They might get some sort of extra effect on you. So engage is a key that you are locked in. It's going to cost movement to just get away from that person, not just to be able to run away, right? There's a risk reward there in terms of, do I just try and flee and risk something, or do I have to pull back through action of my own in order to get further away from that person. So that would be the idea of being engaged. And you could be engaged by multiple targets, right? You could have 2 different people engaged, right? And that might sort of help you denote flanking, which in some games you start ending up with this like Congo line. Well, maybe it's just if there's 2 people engaged with you, now there's certain bonuses they get, right? You could think about if you're outnumbered in an engaged sort of pool, if everyone's engaged with each other, if your numbers are outnumbered, it might start looking like Othello in that sense, that old game. But anyways, so that's engaged. This is nearby, everyone's nearby. A short distance would be if you're just on the outskirts of that zone, right? This person is a short distance from these individuals, right? In our tavern scenario, maybe this is like just outside the door, or this is, over just a little bit. It's still in that zone. I still relate this to being in that zone, but by being on the outside of the index card of that zone, it denotes that you are a short distance from like the skirmish, from like the heart of where the fighting is going on, right? The last one would be long distance. So now say we have a second zone, right? So this is the sort of mead hall or whatever you want to say, like the dining hall. Maybe this is like the bar area, right? And maybe it's a farther way away. Maybe that's not a great example because those things would be closer together. Let's say this is like, I don't know, the graveyard and then this is a field nearby. A long distance away is that I could move from being short distance here to I could move to here on the outskirts of this. I am a long distance from these enemies. And if I'm in the heart of this, I'm a long distance still from these enemies. It's all just a long distance at that point, right? And so if that person wants to get to me, it's going to be move, 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 right? And at this point in time, we're thinking this is a 3 action economy game, right? So maybe they just move to here or something like that. So that would be sort of different zones, right? Now, what if you wanted these zones to interact a little bit more? What if you wanted that bar and the tavern with the bar and etc.? You could take these 2 cards and you could put them directly next to each other, touching. So now this space over here is technically a short distance from this space there because those cards are adjacent. And so what starts happening, which is kind of cool, I think, is that you could start having a lot of cards, and maybe they're all adjacent to each other, right? Maybe they're all adjacent to each other. Maybe you have all of these cards being separated from each other, right? And so now you have this scenario where in spatial orientation, when I move out, I could move over to this area or I could move to this here. And so then you can have like this battleground where there's lots of different sort of frays going on simultaneously. I gotta worry about being in the back. And so you're having to figure out where you need to go. Or maybe all of these, they're all adjacent to each other. So they're all a short distance from each other. So it's a different sort of like little fray going on. So all of this is a short distance to each other, right? So this is my thought of zones, okay? And now you can start, what this does for me to think in zones, and there might be some hiccups here, so I'd love to hear your feedback. But now I can start to actually create the characters and start to create their powers. Because I can think about, for instance, someone who wants to be a striker. There might be different feats that help you do damage based on you or the enemy's orientation. So maybe you have a striker who he is like a swashbuckler type. He wants to be engaged with the target and only be engaged with that target. So maybe there's something else going on over here, but he wants to be one-on-one in essence, right? That's when he gets his bonus or his extra damage. You might have another one who he wants his buddy to be engaged with the enemy, but he's to be free. That's like backstabbing, right? That would be that kind of idea of, oh, he gets a bonus, he gets better when the enemy is engaged and he's free to move around. He's dancing around the fight, right? So that's when he does better. You might have another sort of skirmisher, someone who, or striker, who he wants to be a short distance away. He wants to be on the outskirts, being able to fire in with a crossbow or something, right? So now I'm able to think about this in terms of combat. First, I always try and think thematically first. So now first I get to say, oh, what would be cool abilities for a striker? What denotes a striker? You know, maybe there's the striker who wants to be, I don't know, like a barbarian technically is a striker, someone who's doing massive damage. Maybe there's a striker that wants to have multiple targets against them, or there's an ability that it's like you want lots of people touching you, right? Who knows? Like, it's going to be interesting to think about the power first, and then you think about like visualize what the thing that makes that thing cool, and then you think mechanically what that means to you. But you need some mechanics first. And so now that there's spatial orientation, I can start thinking about mechanics. And so now we can actually put together our encounter. And I already have ideas. The other cool thing, this is just another aside to throw on there. Technically, certain monsters could be an entire space themselves, right? So you could have this entire, what am I doing here? I'm doing color. You could have this entire space be a monster, right? It's coming, and maybe it has attacks that are short distance attacks. So now these guys have to either fire it or I've got to go in there. And what that means is just by being in the same space with this large monster, I'm automatically engaged, right? And I'm automatically susceptible to any sort of area effect attacks it has, or whatever the case is. So there's the idea that a monster is a space unto itself, or a trap is on space unto itself, or etc. So I think there'd be a lot of fun stuff here, and you can just, and as a DM, you can spitball, throw out flashcards on the fly, you know, etc. So hopefully you guys like this idea. I'd love to hear your feedback, and I'm hoping that characters, the 4 characters that I'm trying to create, can be done this week. That's the hope. That's the plan. I'm holding myself to it, right? I'm hoping that I can pump out like 3 or 4 videos this week, actually. So we'll see where we get.